Hi everyone. In our last lecture, we ended up talking about the Paleolithic society, which is defined by hunters and gatherers living off of the land, living off of what was there already. And we're going to see a shift around 9000 BCE from these Paleolithic societies living off the land, hunting animals, foraging wild berries and grains, into a more settled population that are farming, domesticating animals. And this takes place during the agricultural revolution, about 9000 BCE, lasts about 6,000 years to the year 3000 BCE. And this period is going to be seeing a shift from these Paleolithic societies to these more farming societies, that they're starting to settle, they're starting to plant crops, domesticate animals. And we're going to see this happen similarly around the world in different places that did not have contact with one another. For example, North America, Africa, Europe, there's not a lot of contact between human societies at this time. There's none between Europe and North America at this time, but we still see this development happen around the same period in very isolated regions of the world, though they are growing and domesticating different things. So we have rice in Asia, we have pigs, cattle, wheat, barley in Europe, in the Fertile Crescent, barley, cattle, goats, wheat, sheep, pigs. So you see these differences. In the Americas, you have maize, which is corn, you have squash, llamas, potatoes, different crops in different areas, but we still see societies who are relying on first foraging and hunting transition to these settled farming communities who are starting to domesticate and tame wild animals, and it's happening around the same time. So how is it that even though these societies don't have contact with one another, they're still developing along similar lines? So historians have to kind of look at this and say, well, they're not teaching each other, they're not communicating with one another, so what other factors are going to impact these isolated societies at the same time? One of them is the climate. So the climate changing is really what spurred a lot of these communities to start settling down. Around this time in global history, the world is coming out of an ice age, and as the earth is warming, the ice is melting, there's more water in the atmosphere, there's more rain, rivers, lakes, but also the temperature is warmer and more hospitable for humans to stay in place longer. And as you have more water melting, you have more lush climates. So you have along these rivers, along these lakes, you have more vegetation, you have more food sources for people to start foraging around. So there's more ways to live off the land. Because humans were staying in place more, because there was more food in the environment for them to live off of, their population started to grow. They were more healthy, they started having more children, fertility was rising, people started to live longer, they were able to live more nutritionally balanced. But as that standard of living increased because of the better climate, they put more of a strain on the local environment that they were living in. So they started using up more food as their population was growing, and that wasn't sustainable in the long run. So eventually the land they were living in was going to run out of food, and they had to figure out what are different ways that we can live off of the land without depleting it, and then just moving place to place looking for food. How can we remain settled, feed our people off of the land? And they started to experiment with the seeds, with the grain. Instead of consuming everything, they realized that if they took control of nature, if they started planting different seeds, keeping some to eat, and then planting some different grains and seeds, then they can control nature, they can control the crops, they can grow them, and they can also start to adapt the crops and pick ones that were most suitable and to kind of mold them to their needs. So they started to plant, they started to practice agriculture. This first took place in what is today called the Fertile Crescent, along the Tigris and Euphrates River. Today would be Iraq, Palestine. And it was in this Fertile Crescent that over generations, over hundreds of years of experimenting with new tools, with new seeds, foragers were eventually able to develop agricultural societies. They stopped moving around so much. They started settling, they started planting, Through trial and error, they were experimenting with different things, and eventually they started planting seeds. And they were eventually, through this process of trial and error, able to develop the skill of horticulture, which is the science of growing plants. They were able to manipulate plants. They were able to take wild plants and pretty much tame them in a sense. They learned which seasons to plant certain plants, to plant certain seeds, how to save some seeds for the following season, and to balance that. And eventually they would alter through this process the genetic makeup of these plants to become most suitable for people. And by doing this, they were able to live off the land and to extract more food out of the land than they ever could have by just waiting for plants to grow naturally and naturally bear fruit over time, or grains or seeds, whatever it might be. So instead they were able to take these plants, manipulate them into a reliable, sustainable food source for themselves. And this would first happen again in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. So in this Fertile Crescent around 9000 BCE, they were planting wheat and barley. We also see in East Asia they plant rice. In the Americas, of course, squash, beans, and corn. These different crops are pretty much isolated from one another. So you won't see squash and corn enter into Europe, Africa, or the rest of the world until the Columbian Exchange, many thousands of years later. And this manipulation of the environment that characterized the Neolithic era did not just apply to plants in agriculture, it also applied to animals themselves. Around 15,000 years ago, humans domesticated their first animal, which would have been dogs. And dogs had a better sense of smell than people. They were very useful in hunting, in smelling things. They had better hearing, they provided body warmth, and they were just considered an ideal companion for people. Now, dogs were useful to people, but they didn't dramatically alter their way of life. But people realized that if you bred certain animals with friendly characteristics, or if you were able to tame a couple friendly animals and then breed those animals together, you were able to pass on these characteristics to future generations. So if one particular wild wolf or dog was very violent, you wouldn't probably try to domesticate that wolf and tame it and breed it to create more wolves. So this process was very intentional. They looked at wild animals, said, hey, we could tame these animals, or they have characteristics that are favorable for companionship or for taming or eventually a food source. They bred those animals together, and then those positive traits were passed down from generation to generation. Until future generations of these animals were considerably more friendly or docile towards humans. So eventually they started domesticating pigs, cows, horses, goats, and sheep. And this is important because hunting was dangerous. So going out and hunting wild animals was dangerous for people. So, I mean, a lot of times you would get killed or maimed or injured in this process. So instead, if you can have a friendly animal living in the pasture right outside your village, why not just use them as a continual stable food source? So you always know that there's food available for you and they're not likely to hurt you in the process. It's as simple as going out and butchering an animal. Not only was this a reliable food source, but you're able to use them for milk. You're able to use their body parts for different, for clothing, their hides. You're able to use leather. All of this is seen as a stable, beneficial way to achieve these things rather than going out for long periods and hunting. And this mostly happens in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The domestication of animals happens much less in the Americas. In North America, there's really not much of this at all. In South America, you have llamas and you have some domestication of animals, but it's really on a much lower scale than in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Animal manure from these animals, these domesticated animals, is actually enriching the ground making it more nutrient rich for agricultural growth. But also with this increased contact among people and animals, you have the more likelihood for diseases to spread from these animals to people, because of course there was no conception of germs, of washing your hands. So a lot of these germs are going to create diseases in Europe, Asia, and Africa that we do not see in America, because they're not domesticating animals like in the rest of the world, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And it's because of these different pathogens and diseases that develop in that part of the world that doesn't develop in the Americas. That is one of the reasons why when Europeans first arrive in the Americas, those diseases decimate Native American populations, because they did not have any immunity to those diseases. So as time went on in Europe, Africa, and Asia, these diseases from animals are passed around, and over generations they develop immunity to it, which is not happening in the Americas. With this rise of pastoralism, people who are living, taming, domesticating animals, you have a couple different societies emerge. You have the transhuman herders, and those are people who live in relatively the same location. They're not moving very much, but they are moving. They're not settled in agriculture, though they could live in conjunction with a settled agricultural community. But these herders will often migrate depending on the climate. So if it's a warmer period, they'll move up. Let's say if they're living in a valley, they'll move up into the hills or the top of the valley, closer to the mountains. They'll take their animals with them, graze up there in the cooler climate. And then when it gets very cold, when it's a cold season, they would bring their herds down into the valley to get warmer. So they're doing a little bit of moving with their herds, but that's different than nomadic pastoralists, who are pretty much completely nomadic. They're relying on horses, and they're taking their herds. They're continuously moving with their herds. They traveled longer. They didn't have a home base. They're coming into contact with these settled agricultural societies, maybe trading furs for agricultural goods. So they're living in conjunction with one another, sometimes in warfare, but they're moving with their herds. They don't have a home base. So horses are especially important to these people. Think the Mongols. One of the consequences of this agricultural revolution is the society starts to shift from one that is based on relationships and kinship during the Paleolithic society. If you remember, those were mostly family groups. Everybody had relationships with one another. So this is your mom, your cousin, your aunt, your uncle. And those who were respected in society were not based on wealth or the accumulation of goods, but based on their age and their experience, what they can pass down, how they can help the community. That starts to change with this agricultural revolution. So now you have different questions as people are starting to settle, societies are starting to grow. So maybe you don't know everybody in your community anymore. They're not related to you, or if they are, it's very, very distant. You don't necessarily know everybody. You don't have like an immediate kinship with them. So you start needing more rules, like how are you going to relate with these people? When you have a kinship tied to them, you're less likely to steal from them. But if you don't know those people, maybe you're more likely to steal or have friction with them. So who's making the rules now? Also, there's new questions about the food that you're growing. Who's going to distribute it? So you have the farmers who are farming, you have the pastoralists, you have people specializing in different things now, you have like the religious people. So you're getting more food from the land, and people are able to specialize in different things. You have different tasks. So not everybody is necessarily farming now, but how do you divide up who gets the food, where it's stored, all of these logistical things? Who's overseeing trade? Who's enforcing the rules? How do people relate with one another? All these new rules are needed in a settled society that weren't necessarily needed before in these smaller hunting-gathering groups of 20 to 25 relatives. Now we need laws. Now we need leaders. So you see the development of social hierarchies, and that just means you have a leader at the top, you have kind of this, different classes in between, and you have the very bottom who have the very least amount of power. So you have this stratification. Now you have people at the top, you have people in the middle, and you have people at the bottom. That wasn't necessarily the case in the Paleolithic era, where you're hunting, you're gathering, you're dividing it pretty much equally among your families. Now you start to see hierarchies. Somebody's taking control, and that's most likely the person who has the closest proximity to the food source, the source of wealth, right? So now people are starting to accumulate resources, and the more resources they accumulate, because you're not moving around now, so you can start accumulating wealth, becoming more wealthy. You have the most sheep, you have the most crops, you have the most land, you become the most powerful. Now the wealthy are sitting at the top of the scale instead of the people who have been around the longest, who have the knowledge and respect. And because of that, people become increasingly rich, and if you're on the bottom of society, you become increasingly poor and left behind. You start to see social inequalities, whereas you didn't see them before. So with agriculture became stability, settled societies. You knew where your food was coming from. You weren't moving around looking for it all the time, hunting for it, putting your life at risk. But you start to see inequalities, social inequalities, wealth inequalities that didn't exist before. And part of that also leads to gender inequalities. Whereas during the hunting and gathering societies, women and men were seen as kind of more equal partners, where women were foraging and raising children closer to home and providing a significant amount of food for their people. The men were out on longer expeditions hunting, but both were supporting one another. That idea starts to change with this settling of societies. So women were closest to the home because, again, they were giving birth, they were nursing, they had to stay closer together, and a lot of times females would share the responsibility of raising the society's children. As people start to settle into communities and develop cultures, they started to regulate women to the home. So now it became a cultural thing that women needed to stay at home, rather than these are our partners contributing in the way that they were contributing best, but equal partners. It became a cultural thing that women needed to stay at home, that women needed to raise the children, and that men didn't have to go hunting and gathering anymore, but they had more time for other things. They were able to specialize in certain tasks. So some would become farmers and produce food for the society. Others would specialize in other crafts, but that they had this freedom to go out and do these things, whereas women were no longer really needed to forage. They became more and more distanced from the production of food. They were seen as less and less equal partners, and they had fewer opportunities to go out into society and to specialize in different skills. So the more time went on, the more they became kind of relegated to the house, to the home, to child rearing, rather than going out and specializing in anything else like men were going out and doing. Because of this, men increasingly expanded their own wealth and their own skill set and denied that opportunity to women. So we have the development of a patriarchy, which is basically just a society where men are at the top. They hold the power, they hold the wealth, and their power is passed from themselves to their sons, to their sons, to their sons, and it's not really following through the line of the woman. So the father is the head of the household. He's passing his wealth, his power down to his son, not to his daughters. And in societies who don't settle agriculturally, a lot of them would remain matriarchal, which means the mother or the woman is at the center of the family. In Native American societies, up until European contact, they remain mostly matriarchal. Usually the chief of a Native American society would be a man, but women would hold important religious roles, and also the status of a child would be dependent on the mother, not the father. So like we get our last names from our father. In Native American societies, their identity goes through their mother's family, not through their father's. Another reason that women are kept at home more so than men are becomes this issue of inheritance. So if you are a man and you have children, everything you own is going to go to those children. So back then you don't have paternity tests. So how do you know if those are actually your children? And you don't want to pass all your stuff down to somebody else's son. So you want to make sure, and again, you can't do paternity tests, you can't check their DNA and make sure it matches up. So you want to make sure that your kids are actually your kids. So because of that, men start, again, limiting women from going out and having contact with other men, with society. So if you keep your woman in the home, they're not going out, there's less of a chance that those children might not actually be yours, because you're the only man who sees your wife or spouse or partner. But again, if she doesn't have proximity to other men, those must be your children, and there's less doubt and question about that. So this issue of inheritance, of making sure your children are your own, keeps women at home, away from society, away from different skills they could be learning or accumulating wealth. And I'm going to leave us with some reflective questions from the chapter and from this video lecture. You should be able to answer what were some of the key features of the Paleolithic societies compared with the Neolithic societies. So you should be able to distinguish the two, talk about key features, and especially after this lecture, how did plants and animals domestication develop and what effect did it have on human societies? And as we just talked about, why and how did social hierarchies develop? So you should be able to answer these, again, if they appear on essays or questions moving forward. If not, definitely go back and check the chapter or this video.